Sometimes the first sign that a system is becoming unstable is not outrage, it's laughter. And that's strange when you think about it, because when we imagine major change, we usually imagine anger, protests, conflict, resistance. People openly challenging what they no longer believe. But throughout history, something else often appears first: jokes, parody, satire, mockery. A growing sense that something which once felt unquestionable has somehow become difficult to take seriously. And maybe that's because laughter does something unusual. It slips past defenses. It bypasses explanations. It exposes contradictions people may not have fully articulated yet. Sometimes people laugh because something is funny. Sometimes people laugh because something is uncomfortable. And sometimes people laugh because a truth has just appeared that they weren't expecting to see, which is interesting because throughout history, some of the most dangerous truths were often spoken by people society treated like fools. Not kings, not priests, not scholars. Fools, jesters, tricksters. The people standing just outside the normal rules. The people wearing masks. The people speaking through riddles. The people saying things sideways. And maybe that's part of why trickster figures appear in so many cultures. Loki in Norse mythology, Coyote in many indigenous traditions, Hermes in Greek mythology, Anazi the spider in Western African stories. Again and again, cultures seem to create figures who blur boundaries, break expectations, steal things that they aren't supposed to steal, and somehow leave the world changed afterwards. Not always for the better, not always for the worse, just different. And what makes these figures fascinating is that they rarely confront a system directly. Instead, they flip it, distort it, mirror it, expose it. They reveal something by turning it upside down, which may be why trickster stories often feel strangely funny right up until the moment they become uncomfortable. Because underneath the laughter, there's usually a contradiction waiting to be discovered, a hidden weakness, an assumption nobody questioned, a rule that only seemed permanent because everyone agreed to keep pretending it was. And maybe that's why societies have always had complicated relationships with trickster figures. People are often drawn to them, entertained by them, fascinated by them, but also a little uneasy around them. Because the trickster has a habit of revealing things that are easier to ignore when left hidden. A king becomes ridiculous. A certainty becomes fragile. A performance becomes visible as a performance. And once you've seen it, it's often difficult to completely unsee it, which raises an interesting question. Why do humans repeatedly create stories about figures whose primary role seems to be disrupting certainty itself? Because if stability is what people want, why do so many cultures keep telling stories about the character who walks in and turns everything upside down? Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. And maybe that's why so many cultures created a place for the fool. Not because societies enjoy being mocked, not because authority enjoys criticism, but because sometimes truth becomes easier to hear when it arrives indirectly. Throughout history, court jesters occupied a strange position. They were often among the lowest ranking people in the room. And yet, they sometimes possessed a freedom that even powerful advisors did not. A king could punish a critic. A king could silence a rival. A king could ignore a warning. But a fool? A fool could often say things sideways, through jokes, through imitation, through exaggeration, through performance. And somehow, truths that might have been intolerable in ordinary conversation became acceptable when they arrived disguised as entertainment. Which raises an interesting question. Why? Why would a society tolerate dangerous truths from a fool that it would reject from a scholar, a politician, or a priest? Maybe because direct truth often activates defenses. People argue with it, resist it, protect themselves from it. But indirect truth works differently. A joke slips through, a parody slips through, a riddle slips through. And before someone fully realizes what's happening, they find themselves laughing at something they secretly recognize. The truth arrives first. The defenses arrive later. And maybe that's why trickster figures so often communicate through inversion. They don't simply state the contradiction, they flip it. They magnify it. They mirror it. Turn it upside down until something hidden suddenly becomes visible. Which is interesting because many traditional trickster figures are not primarily warriors. They're not conquering through force. They're stealing, disguising, shape-shifting, crossing boundaries, breaking rules that everyone else assumes are fixed. Loki changes shape. Hermes steals. Coyote blurs lines. A Nazi outwits figures far more powerful than himself. Again and again, the trickster succeeds not because it's stronger than the system around it, but because it notices something everyone else missed. Again and again, the trickster succeeds not by overpowering a system, but by revealing that the system was never quite as solid as people believed. And maybe that's why trickster stories often feel funny right up until the moment they become uncomfortable. Because underneath the humor is usually a hidden question, a contradiction, a weakness, a blind spot. Something everyone was participating in without fully noticing. In many cultures, there were even entire festivals built around temporary inversion, periods where ordinary roles reversed. Servants mocked masters, authority became parody, rules relaxed, and order loosened. For a brief moment, society turned itself upside down. And what's fascinating is that these traditions were not necessarily attempts to destroy order. In many cases, they may have helped to preserve it. Because temporary inversion allowed tensions to become visible before they became unbearable. The pressure escaped through laughter. The contradiction became visible. The performance became exposed. And then often society returned to normal, which suggests something interesting about the trickster. Maybe the trickster's role is not to destroy systems. Maybe the trickster's role is to reveal where rigidity has started replacing reality, to expose the places where performance has become more important than truth, to point toward the fracture before the fracture becomes impossible to ignore. Maybe that's why the trickster continues appearing throughout history. Not because humans enjoy chaos, but because humans have a remarkable ability to normalize contradiction. And every once in a while, something has to hold up a mirror, even if that mirror arrives wearing a mask. And maybe that's where the trickster becomes even more interesting, because the trickster doesn't simply challenge authority. The trickster challenges certainty itself, not by arguing against it, not by replacing it, but by turning it upside down long enough for people to see it differently. Throughout history, many cultures developed traditions built around temporary inversion. For a brief period, the ordinary rules loosened, roles reversed, hierarchies blurred, the world turned upside down. Servants mocked masters, fools became kings, authority became parody. And what makes these traditions fascinating is that they often existed inside the very societies they appeared to challenge, which suggests something strange. Maybe people have always understood that complete rigidity creates its own kind of instability. Because when a system becomes too fixed, too unquestioned, too certain of itself, tension begins accumulating beneath the surface. Contradictions become harder to acknowledge. Weaknesses become harder to discuss. Performance becomes harder to interpret. And eventually, reality starts competing with the story people are telling about reality, which is where the trickster often appears. Not necessarily to destroy the structure, but to expose the gap between the structure and the truth. And maybe that's why so many trickster figures wear disguises, masks, hidden faces, shifting identities. Because the trickster rarely approaches a boundary directly. Instead, it crosses the boundary, blurs the boundary, questions whether the boundary was ever as fixed as people believed. A god becomes an animal. A fool becomes a king. A thief becomes a teacher. A joke becomes a revelation. A mask becomes a mirror. Again and again, the trickster seems fascinated by the places where categories begin breaking down, which is uncomfortable for most people, because humans generally like stable categories. We like knowing who someone is, what role they occupy, what rules apply, what things mean. We like certainty, or at least we think we do. But the trickster keeps asking uncomfortable questions. What if the fool is wiser than the king? What if the outsider sees something the insider cannot? What if the performance has become more important than the truth? What if the thing everyone is laughing at is actually revealing something important? And what's fascinating is these questions rarely arrive as direct arguments. They arrive as riddles, contradictions, parodies, inversions. The trickster doesn't hand people answers. The trickster hands people mirrors. And not always comfortable mirrors. Sometimes distorted mirrors. Sometimes exaggerated mirrors. Sometimes mirrors that make people laugh before they realize that they're looking at themselves, which may be why the trickster can feel both entertaining and unsettling at the same time. Because the laughter is often real, but so is the recognition. And maybe that's the deeper purpose of inversion, not simply to reverse the world, but to reveal parts of the world that become invisible when viewed from only one angle. Because sometimes the fastest way to expose a hidden assumption is to flip it. And maybe that's why the trickster never really disappears. The costumes change, the technologies change, the stories change, but the underlying pattern keeps returning. Because once you start recognizing trickster energy, it becomes surprisingly difficult not to notice it. You begin seeing it in comedians who expose tensions that everyone feels but nobody quite knows how to articulate. You see it in satire, in parody, in memes, in absurd observations that somehow reveal something more quickly than a serious explanation ever could. And what's interesting is that many modern forms of communication seem almost perfectly designed for trickster behavior. A meme can compress an entire social contradiction into a single image. A joke can expose a hidden tension in a few seconds. A parody can reveal weaknesses that lengthy arguments struggle to communicate. And often people find themselves laughing before they fully understand why, which is remarkably similar to the role trickster figures have been playing throughout history. The medium changes. The mechanism remains familiar. And maybe that's part of why modern culture feels saturated with irony. Because irony allows people to communicate things indirectly. It creates distance, plausible deniability, protection. The truth can arrive disguised as a joke. The criticism can arrive disguised as entertainment. The contradiction can arrive disguised as absurdity. And sometimes that indirect approach works because once again, the defenses arrive after the recognition. Which brings me to someone I've always found fascinating, Andy Kaufman. Because Kaufman seemed less interested in making people laugh than in making people question what was happening. Was he serious? Was he joking? Was he performing? Was he being authentic? Often the audience couldn't tell. And that uncertainty was part of the experience. He blurred boundaries. He disrupted expectations. He refused to stay inside the categories people wanted him to occupy. At times it was funny. At times it was irritating. At times it was genuinely uncomfortable. But underneath the performance, there often seemed to be a larger question. What exactly are we expecting from each other? What assumptions are we making without realizing it? What happens when someone refuses to follow the script everyone else is quietly agreeing to? And maybe that's the most recognizable signs of trickster energy. Not chaos, not destruction, not rebellion for its own sake, but the disruption of unconscious assumptions. The moment when a performance becomes visible as a performance. The moment when a certainty becomes exposed as a story people have collectively agreed to tell. The moment when something feels funny and unsettling at exactly the same time. Because underneath the laughter, there's often a mirror. And once you begin noticing those mirrors, you start realizing that the trickster may not be a character from the past at all. The trickster may be a recurring force that appears whenever contradiction becomes difficult to ignore. Whenever certainty becomes too rigid. Whenever a system becomes too confident in its own story that nobody remembers to question it anymore. And if that's true, then perhaps the question is not whether the trickster still exists. Perhaps the question is, where is it hiding now? You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice. And not to conclude, but to understand. And maybe that's where the trickster becomes a little more complicated. Because up until now, we've mostly been looking at the trickster as something useful, a force that reveals contradiction, a force that exposes blind spots, a force that interrupts certainty when certainty has become too rigid. And sometimes that's exactly what's needed. Sometimes the fool reveals something everyone else missed. Sometimes the parody exposes a weakness. Sometimes the mirror shows us something we genuinely need to see. But what happens when the inversion never stops? What happens when the mask never comes off? What happens when disruption stops being a tool and starts becoming an identity? Because every archetype has a shadow. And the shadow of the trickster is not necessarily chaos. It's detachment. It's cynicism. It's the inability to sincerely participate in anything for very long. And I think we see hints of that in modern culture sometimes. Not because modern culture is uniquely broken, but because irony has become one of the primary ways people communicate. Humor becomes protection. Distance becomes protection. Nothing is fully serious. Everything remains slightly performative, slightly detached, slightly buffered. And at first, that can feel freeing because irony can expose contradiction. It can challenge authority. It can puncture arrogance. It can reveal hidden tension. But eventually, a different question begins to emerge. What happens when every belief becomes a joke? What happens when every conviction becomes a parody? What happens when sincerity itself starts feeling embarrassing? Because at some point, the mirror stops revealing things and starts becoming a place to hide. The performance remains. The laughter remains. The inversion remains. But the deeper purpose quietly disappears. And that's where the trickster begins transforming into something else. Not revelation, fragmentation, not awareness, detachment, not playful disruption, performative distance. Because if every structure is mocked, eventually people lose the ability to build. If every belief is ridiculed, eventually people lose the ability to commit. If every conviction becomes ironic, eventually people lose the ability to care. And that's why the trickster cannot be a permanent home. The trickster can expose the fracture. The trickster can reveal the contradiction. The trickster can point toward the hidden tension. But eventually something else has to happen. Eventually people have to decide what comes next. Because the purpose of exposing illusion is not to remain trapped in endless inversion. The purpose is to see more clearly what is actually there. And maybe that's the shadow warning hidden inside trickster stories all along. That disruption is powerful, but disruption alone is not enough. At some point, the mask has to come off. And maybe that's where the deepest misunderstanding of the trickster begins. Because after everything we've talked about, it would be easy to conclude that the answer is simply less disruption, less questioning, less inversion, less contradiction. But I don't think that's the lesson at all, because the trickster exists for a reason. The fool exists for a reason. The mirror exists for a reason. The parody exists for a reason. The disruption exists for a reason. Something needs to expose the fracture. Something needs to reveal the blind spot. Something needs to interrupt the story when the story has drifted too far away from reality. And throughout history, the trickster has often been the figure willing to do exactly that. The problem isn't disruption. The problem is forgetting what disruption is for. Because the purpose of exposing a contradiction is not merely to expose it. The purpose is to understand it. The purpose of revealing a blind spot is not simply to point at it. The purpose is to become more aware of it. The purpose of holding up a mirror is not to stare at the mirror forever. The purpose is to see what the mirror reveals. And maybe that's where the trickster functions best. Not as a permanent identity, not as a world view or as a place to live, but as a threshold, a crossing point, a catalyst. The figure who appears when something has become too rigid, too fixed, too certain, too unconscious, and who disrupts that certainty just long enough for something new to become possible. Because if the tower clears away what can no longer stand, and if symbols help humans organize meaning, then perhaps the trickster helps expose the places where meaning has become trapped inside assumptions nobody is questioning anymore. Not by providing answers, but by reopening questions. And maybe that's why trickster figures often appear near transitions, near thresholds, near turning points, near moments when old identities no longer fit and new identities have not fully formed. Because transitions are uncomfortable. They're uncertain. They're unstable. And during those moments, certainty often becomes harder to trust. The old story no longer works. The new story hasn't arrived yet. And that's precisely where the trickster tends to appear. Not to provide certainty, but to loosen the grip of certainty long enough for transformation to begin. Because sometimes the thing preventing growth is not a lack of answers. Sometimes it's an answer that's become too rigid to question. And perhaps that's the gift hidden inside the trickster. Not chaos, not destruction, not endless inversion, but movement. The ability to step outside a pattern long enough to see it differently. The ability to question a story long enough to understand it more deeply. The ability to laugh long enough to recognize that something had previously remained hidden. And maybe that's why the trickster continues appearing throughout human history. Not because humans are drawn to disorder, but because every system, every identity, every belief, and every story eventually risks becoming so familiar that people stop seeing it clearly. And every once in a while, something has to interrupt the performance. Not to destroy it, but to wake it up. And maybe that's where the trickster leaves us. Not with certainty, not with answers, not even with conclusions, but with better questions. Because throughout this episode, we've looked at fools, jesters, satire, parody, inversion, masks, mirrors, and contradiction. And underneath all of them, a similar pattern kept appearing. The trickster interrupts. The trickster exposes. The trickster reveals. Not necessarily to destroy what exists, but to make visible what has become difficult to see. Sometimes that's uncomfortable. Sometimes it's amusing. Sometimes it's frustrating. And sometimes it's exactly what's needed. Because every person, every institution, every belief system, and every story risks becoming so familiar that parts of it disappear from view. And every once in a while, something has to turn the picture upside down. Not so that we can live upside down forever, but so we can notice what we've stopped noticing. And maybe that's why trickster figures continue appearing across cultures, myths, stories, and human experience. Not because humans love chaos, but because humans need reminders. Reminders that certainty can become rigid, that assumptions can become invisible, that performances can become mistaken for reality. And sometimes the thing that feels disruptive is actually revealing something important. Not every contradiction contains wisdom. Not every disruption contains truth. But some do. And perhaps discernment begins by learning the difference. Because the goal is not endless inversion. The goal is awareness. And perhaps that's the gift hidden inside the trickster after all. Not chaos, not confusion, awareness. The moment you realize there may be more to see than you first imagined. And next week, we'll continue exploring the trickster from a different angle. Because if disruption is only the beginning, then perhaps the deeper question is this: why does truth so often arrive wearing a disguise. Come back next week. I'll see you there.